Ever since I can remember, Jerry Lewis was there on TV, his films shuffled out of order so that on Saturday afternoon he'd be a skinny 25-year-old black and white geek, and by Sunday afternoon, he'd be a good-looking 30-something, drenched in glorious technicolor. Then midweek, he'd be guesting on Sonny and Cher, a brill-creamed elder statesman in a tux and white socks, playing both his own straight man and Patsy. He was, somehow, a cool man-child, dancing madly to Count Basie and about as unlikely a comedy icon as you could think of, but he'd been one of the biggest and most influential for over half a century. Back in the 60s, the French critics mentioned him in same breath as Chaplin and Keaton. As for the American critics, well, let's just say that if they mentioned him at all, it was while shaking their heads. In his heyday though, audiences loved him. From the 50s as one half of the most successful comedy teams of all time, right through to maturity as a solo act which saw him become the most popular film comedian in the English-speaking world, and love him or hate him, and it's one or the other, there's no middle ground. Jerry Lewis is impossible to ignore. It's not every day you get to meet a comedy icon, someone you grew up on, who was the reason you got into comedy, your childhood hero. For me it was a Thursday in July back in the year 2000. He was visiting Australia for a return season of the show he'd done in 1998, cut short when he was taken ill. I'd seen it in Melbourne in the Palladium room of the Crown Casino. It was Las Vegas slick, but at 72 he had, of course, slowed down and couldn't possibly match on stage the same antic spirit of the clips he showed to catch his breath. But I was glad I went and saw him. This time around, though, I thought it'd be fun to meet him. I contacted the agent, asked whether they'd like me to do a profile piece. They said yes, and I contacted his people, arranged it, and flew to Sydney for a press conference and one-on-one interview. Simple as that. And what the Age was paying me covered the cost of the plane ticket. Perfect. The press conference was in a conference room at Star City Casino. I was early and so hung around in the lobby, waiting. I hadn't needed to do any research or prepare any notes because I already knew so much about him. My preparation therefore consisted of reminding myself not to sound too much like a fanboy. The only things I'd brought along were a 1961 copy of Life magazine which featured a spread on the huge, doll's house set he'd used in The Ladies' Man, and a first edition of his 1971 book The Total Filmmaker, which I was thinking of asking him to sign for me at the end of the interview, if it went well. I'd heard he could be prickly. He arrived early too. Dressed in a blue and red tracksuit that sported his own caricature and logo, he and his entourage streamed out of the lift and made their way to the conference room. I saw him deliberately walk into the wrong one and start talking to the group of architects in there, pretending he was their next speaker and ad-libbing his way through whatever was on the whiteboard, much to their amusement and delight. He left to a round of applause and disappeared through another door. Inside the right conference room I could hear a radio mic being attached to his tracksuit. He was talking to Chrissy, his publicist, in an Irish accent. He sounded in a good mood. Someone introduced him and he strode into some polite applause. The architects had been more effusive. First up, he apologized for an unpaid hospital bill from his last visit, a misunderstanding, he explained, which had now been taken care of. No doubt he wanted to clear the air and make way for questions about the tour. Nonetheless, the first few questions were about the unpaid bill and he fielded them with good humor and diplomacy. Then the questions got onto the reason for his hospital stay, about a viral meningitis, and his health generally. He said he was fine, much recovered, thank you. When was he going to retire, someone asked. He said, pointedly, that he had no plans and that, in fact, he was doing a tour. Was a tour wise when he was so susceptible to illness? Implied someone else. At that point I thought I'd help, unfortunately letting my fanboy run amok and asking a question about a bug that flew in his ear in a drive-in movie theater appearance back in 1963. He did a take. How can you remember, he began, but then saw that I was too young to have remembered. How do you know that? He asked under the laughter from the room. Then he was asked about why he didn't think women were funny, a reference to something he'd said at the Montreal Comedy Festival the previous year. He got serious and explained that he just didn't like women doing crude material. Again, I thought I'd help. I mentioned that he'd worked with Kathleen Freeman many times and obviously found her funny. He agreed. He's seen her only last week, he said.